The biggest mistake people make is believing that the value of a man can be measured by the vehicle sitting in his driveway. Every family has a story they tell themselves about the people they love, and sometimes that story becomes so familiar that nobody stops to ask whether it is actually true. My parents believed they understood me better than anyone else. They believed they knew why I still drove an old pickup truck that rattled every time I started the engine, why I refused to replace the faded paint that had long surrendered to years of Midwest winters, and why I never parked it beside the polished luxury vehicles owned by many of my friends. They thought I was stubborn. They thought I was cheap. Most of all, they thought I was afraid to enjoy the success I had worked so hard to earn. They could not have been more wrong. It all came to the surface during a Sunday family dinner at my parents' house just outside Columbus, Ohio. My father, Michael Carter, had spent the afternoon grilling hamburgers in the backyard while my mother, Karen, prepared homemade potato salad and fresh corn on the cob. My older sister, Sophia, arrived with her husband and their 2 children just before dinner, filling the house with the familiar sounds of laughter and conversations that had been repeated for years. Family dinners were always comfortable until someone decided it was time to offer advice that nobody had requested. As I stepped out of my old dark blue pickup and closed the driver's side door with the same gentle push I had used thousands of times before, my father looked through the front window and laughed before I even reached the porch. "That truck is still alive?" he called loudly enough for everyone inside to hear. I smiled as I walked through the front door. "Apparently it is." He shook his head with a grin. "I thought for sure this would be the year you finally bought yourself something respectable." My mother handed me a glass of iced tea before joining the conversation. "Your father is right. You work too hard to keep driving something that old. It makes people think you are struggling." I simply thanked her for the tea and sat down without arguing. Over the years I had learned that defending myself only encouraged longer discussions. Silence usually ended them much faster. My sister leaned back in her chair and smiled. "I drove past your truck in the driveway. I cannot believe you still have it. I honestly thought you were keeping it for sentimental reasons until you finally decided to buy a new one." My father laughed again. At this point, I think he enjoys making mechanics rich. Everyone around the table chuckled except me. I smiled politely because I knew none of them intended to be cruel. They genuinely believed they were encouraging me to enjoy life a little more. They simply had no idea what that truck actually meant to me. Dinner continued with conversations about work, school, neighborhood news, and vacation plans until my father looked across the table and asked the question I had heard more times than I could count. "So, when are you finally going to buy a decent truck?" I took another sip of iced tea before answering calmly. "Mine still gets me where I need to go." He frowned slightly. "That was not the question." My mother nodded in agreement. "You have a good career. You can afford something newer." Sophia smiled. "Even a gently used truck would be an improvement." I laughed softly. "Maybe someday." My father leaned forward. "Jacob, sometimes I think you worry too much about spending money. Life is meant to be enjoyed." I looked at him for a moment before answering. "I do enjoy my life." He smiled kindly but unconvinced. "You know what I mean." I didn't know what he meant. To him, success should be visible. It should be parked in the driveway, worn on your wrist, or reflected in the neighborhood where you lived. My father had worked hard his entire life, and I respected every sacrifice he had made for our family. He believed financial success should be celebrated because he had spent decades working toward stability. I never blamed him for that belief. We simply measured success differently. As dinner came to an end, my father walked outside with me while everyone else cleared the table. He rested one hand on the hood of my pickup and smiled. "You know I only tease you because I want to see you enjoy what you have earned." I nodded. "I know, Dad." He looked at the truck one more time. "Promise me you will at least start looking at newer models this year." I smiled without making the promise he wanted to hear. "I will think about it." He laughed. "That means no." "Probably," I admitted. We both smiled before he returned inside. I remained alone in the driveway for another minute, looking at the truck under the warm evening light. The faded paint, the small dent above the rear wheel, and the worn steering wheel all told a story that nobody else could see. To everyone around me, it was just an old pickup that should have been replaced years ago. To me, it represented something money could never buy back. My phone vibrated inside my pocket. I glanced at the screen and saw a secure banking notification confirming that a multi-million-dollar transfer had successfully reached one of my investment accounts earlier that afternoon. It was the largest financial transaction of my life so far, more than enough to buy any luxury truck sitting on a dealership lot in America without thinking twice. I locked the screen without replying to any messages, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and rested one hand on the worn steering wheel through the open window. Then I smiled quietly to myself and whispered the same words I had repeated every year for a very long time. You are staying with me a little longer. We are not finished yet. The next morning I left home before sunrise, just as I had done for years. The old pickup started with the same familiar rumble that most people would have considered another reason to replace it. To me, it sounded like an old friend saying good morning. I drove through the quiet streets of Columbus before joining the interstate, watching the first lights spread across the horizon. The truck was not fast, and it certainly was not impressive, but every mile behind that worn steering wheel reminded me that some things become more valuable because of the memories they carry instead of the price someone is willing to pay for them. About 30 minutes later, I turned into the parking lot of Carter Industrial Systems, the manufacturing technology company. I had spent the past 7 years building from the ground up. Most people outside the business had never heard my name connected to the company because I preferred keeping the attention focused on our employees and our customers rather than myself. More than 80 people work there now, designing automation equipment that helped manufacturers improve efficiency across the country. As I parked my pickup beside the loading dock instead of the reserved executive spaces near the entrance, several employees waved as they walked toward the building carrying coffee and backpacks. "Morning, Jacob," one technician called. "Morning," I answered with a smile. Another employee laughed while pointing toward the truck. "Still running. Better than ever," I replied. "Then I guess mine has no excuse." Everyone laughed before heading inside. None of them cared what I drove because they judged me by the way I treated people every day. That had always mattered more to me than appearances. As soon as I entered the building, Rachel Evans, our operations manager, walked toward me holding a tablet. "Good morning. The production review starts in 15 minutes, and Andrew Collins called earlier. He confirmed his flight landed on time." I nodded. "Perfect. Has the customer tour been finalized?" "Almost," she answered. "The engineering team finished preparing the demonstration area last night." We walked together toward the conference room while discussing hiring plans, equipment upgrades, and delivery schedules. The company had grown steadily because we focused on solving practical problems instead of chasing attention. Every decision was made with the same philosophy that had guided us from the beginning. Spend money where it creates long-term value, never where it simply creates a good first impression. After the production meeting ended, Rachel handed me another folder. "There is one more item you should know about," she said. "Andrew wants to bring additional investors when he visits next week." I looked up. "More than originally planned?" She nodded. "He believes they will be interested after seeing the expansion plans." I smiled quietly. "Then we make sure they see the people behind the company, not just the equipment." Rachel smiled. "That is exactly what I expected you to say." She had worked beside me for nearly 5 years and understood that I believe culture always came before growth. Expensive buildings and impressive presentations meant very little if employees did not genuinely believe in what they were building together. Later that afternoon, Andrew Collins called while I was reviewing the final budget for a new production line. "Jacob," he said enthusiastically, "I think you are going to like this. 3 additional partners want to join the visit. They have been following your company for months." "That is good news," I answered. "We are looking forward to meeting everyone." Andrew laughed softly. "One more thing. I told them not to expect flashy presentations because I know you." "You told them correctly." "I also told them they would probably find you driving that old pickup again." I smiled while looking through my office window toward the parking lot where the truck sat exactly where I had left it. "It still gets me here every morning." "That truck has become part of your reputation," Andrew replied. "People remember authenticity." After the call ended, my phone vibrated with another incoming message. This time it was from my father. I opened the text and immediately smiled because I already knew what it would say before reading a single word. Attached was a photograph of a brand new pickup advertised by a local dealership. Under the picture he had written, "Great financing available. You should finally treat yourself." I laughed quietly before typing my reply. "Thanks, Dad. I hope you and Mom have a great week." I never mentioned the truck because I knew another discussion would accomplish nothing. He believed he was helping me. That mattered more than winning an argument. As the workday came to an end, I walked back toward the parking lot while several employees finished loading equipment for a customer delivery. One young engineer stopped beside my truck and smiled. "You know, when I first interviewed here, I thought that pickup belonged to someone from the maintenance department." I laughed. "You were not the first person to think that." He grinned. "Now I think it reminds everyone that success does not have to look expensive." After he left, I opened the driver's side door and rested my hand on the worn steering wheel for a brief moment. My grandfather had done exactly the same thing countless times before every early morning delivery decades ago. I could still remember sitting beside him as a little boy, listening to him say that tools should never be judged by how shiny they looked, but by whether they helped you build something worthwhile. The truck had become much more than transportation. It carried the final promise I had ever made to him, and I intended to keep that promise no matter how many people misunderstood it. As I drove home beneath the golden light of the setting sun, I had no idea that within a few days the truth behind that old pickup would begin changing everything my family believed they knew about me. The rest of the week moved faster than usual as our entire company prepared for one of the most important visits in its history. Every department focused on the details that truly mattered instead of creating an artificial show for our guests. I reminded everyone during our Monday morning meeting that we were not trying to impress anyone with polished speeches or expensive decorations. We were simply inviting people to see who we really were. The engineers continued improving product demonstrations, the production team organized the manufacturing floor, and the customer support department gathered stories that showed how our equipment had helped businesses become more efficient. Watching everyone work together reminded me why I had invested nearly every extra dollar back into the company instead of spending it on things that looked successful from the outside. Real growth had always required patience. By Wednesday afternoon, Rachel Evans walked into my office carrying another stack of reports. "The final visitor schedule is complete," she said. "Andrew Collins will arrive tomorrow morning with 4 investment partners instead of 3. I smiled. "Looks like the group keeps growing." Rachel nodded. "Word travels fast when companies keep delivering results." She placed the reports on my desk before adding, "Several of them specifically asked to meet the founder because they have heard you built the company differently." I leaned back in my chair and smiled slightly. "Then they should spend most of their time talking to our employees. They are the reason we are here." Rachel laughed. "You always redirect the credit. Because it belongs there." After she left, I spent another hour reviewing hiring plans for the coming months. If everything went well with the upcoming partnership, we would add nearly 20 new employees before the end of the year. That thought excited me far more than any financial milestone because every new job represented another family receiving stability through honest work. As I prepared to leave the office, my phone buzzed once again with a familiar notification. My father had sent another message. This time it was a link to a dealership advertising a year-end sale on new pickup trucks. His message read, "This one would finally make you look like the successful professional you are." I could not help smiling because his consistency was almost admirable. I replied exactly as I always did. "Thank you, Dad. I hope you and Mom are doing well." A few seconds later, he called instead of texting. "Jacob," he said cheerfully, "did you look at the truck?" "I saw it. It is a great deal. Low mileage, excellent condition, and plenty of room. You deserve something like that." I laughed softly. "Mine still has plenty of room, too." He sighed playfully. "You are impossible." "Probably." He became quiet for a moment before speaking again. "You know your mother worries that people judge you when they see that old truck." I looked through my office window toward the parking lot where it remained parked in the same place it always had. If someone judges me before meeting me, I probably cannot change that with a different truck. He chuckled. "You always have an answer. Maybe I have just had a lot of practice." We both laughed before ending the call. I knew he meant well. He simply believed appearances opened doors. My experience had taught me that character kept those doors open long after first impressions faded. The following morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The production floor already buzzed with activity as employees prepared customer demonstrations and completed final inspections. Rachel greeted me near the entrance. "Everything is ready," she said confidently. "Andrew called from the airport. They should be here in less than an hour." Together we walked through every department, greeting employees and answering last-minute questions. Nobody seemed nervous. They were simply proud of what they had built together. As I finished speaking with one of our engineering teams, a young technician smiled and pointed toward my pickup parked outside the side entrance. I still cannot believe you refused to move that truck into the executive parking spaces. I smiled. It seems happy where it is. He laughed. It definitely gets more attention than some luxury vehicles. Before I could answer, Rachel looked out the window and noticed a black SUV entering the parking lot. They are here, she said. Andrew Collins stepped out first, followed by 4 professionally dressed investors who immediately began observing every detail of the facility around them. I walked outside to greet them with a handshake. Andrew smiled broadly. Jacob, thank you for having us. We are glad you made the trip. He introduced each member of the group before one of the visitors unexpectedly looked past me toward the old pickup parked beside the loading dock. Is that your truck? He asked. Yes, I answered honestly. The investor smiled with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Interesting. Andrew laughed quietly. I told you about it. The visitor nodded. You did. I was not sure whether to believe you. I smiled. It still gets me to work every morning. The man looked at the truck for another brief moment before turning back toward me. Then I think I am even more interested in hearing your story. As we walked toward the entrance together, none of us noticed that only a few miles away my parents were making plans for a weekend shopping trip that would unexpectedly bring them much closer to my office than they had ever intended, setting the stage for a discovery that none of us could have predicted. The visit began exactly the way I had hoped it would. Instead of gathering everyone inside a polished conference room filled with impressive presentations, I invited Andrew Collins and his investment partners onto the production floor where the real work happened every day. The steady sound of machines, the conversations between engineers, and the teamwork that filled the building told a far more honest story than any collection of colorful charts ever could. One of the visitors paused beside a technician who was calibrating a new automation system and asked several detailed questions. Rather than looking at me for answers, I stepped back and allowed our employee to explain the entire process. After several minutes, the investor smiled with genuine appreciation. You have built a team that knows exactly what they are doing, he said. That is much more valuable than a founder who tries to answer every question himself. I thanked him, but quietly reminded everyone that great companies were never built by one person. They were built by people who trusted each other enough to solve problems together. Throughout the morning, the visitors met engineers, production supervisors, customer service representatives, and warehouse specialists. Every conversation reinforced the same message without anyone planning it. People genuinely enjoyed working there because they believed they were contributing to something meaningful. During lunch, we gathered inside the employee break room instead of ordering an extravagant catered meal. Everyone shared sandwiches, soup, fresh fruit, and homemade desserts that several employees had brought from home. One of the investors looked around the room and smiled. I have toured dozens of successful companies over the years, he said. Most founders spend a fortune trying to impress investors. You seem more interested in introducing us to your employees. I smiled. If you decide to work with us, you are investing in them far more than you are investing in me. Andrew nodded with satisfaction because he had heard me say similar words many times before. After lunch, we walked through the newest expansion area where additional production equipment would soon be installed. Rachel Evans explained the construction schedule while I answered questions about future hiring plans. The discussion naturally shifted toward long-term growth, supply chain improvements, and customer demand across several industries. By the end of the afternoon, every visitor appeared encouraged by what they had seen. Before leaving, Andrew asked if we could spend a few minutes speaking privately in my office. Once everyone sat down, he smiled broadly. Jacob, I think today exceeded every expectation. One of the investors agreed immediately. What impressed me most was not the technology. It was the culture. That is much harder to create. Another added, I have also been thinking about your truck. Everyone laughed. I smiled because I knew the conversation would eventually return to it. Most people do. The investor folded his hands together. At first, I assumed it was simply an unusual personal choice. After spending the day here, I realize it reflects the entire philosophy behind this company. You invest in what creates lasting value instead of appearances. I nodded quietly without saying anything else. There was no need to explain further. They had already understood something many people overlooked. As the meeting concluded, Andrew confirmed that formal partnership discussions would continue the following week. We shook hands before everyone departed for the airport. After the building became quiet again, I walked through the nearly empty production floor while employees finished their shifts. Several people thanked me for allowing them to participate in the tour, but I reminded them that they had been the reason the visit succeeded. When I finally stepped outside, the familiar blue pickup waited beneath the late afternoon sun exactly where I had parked it that morning. I unlocked the door and paused for a moment before getting inside. My grandfather used to tell me that if success ever changed the way I treated ordinary things, then success had probably changed me for the worse. Those words had stayed with me through every promotion, every difficult decision, every financial milestone, and every opportunity to replace this truck with something far more expensive. On Saturday morning, my parents decided to spend the day shopping on the north side of Columbus. My mother wanted to visit a large home improvement store before stopping at several furniture showrooms nearby. My father happily agreed because he enjoyed looking at new tools almost as much as he enjoyed giving me advice about buying a different truck. As they drove through an industrial district neither of them visited very often, traffic slowed because of ongoing road construction. My father turned onto a side street, hoping to avoid the delay. As they passed several office buildings and manufacturing facilities, my mother looked out the passenger window and suddenly pointed toward a familiar vehicle parked beside a large modern building. "Michael," she said with surprise, "does that look like Jacob's truck?" My father slowed the car and stared through the windshield. The faded blue paint, the small dent above the rear wheel, and the worn bumper were impossible to mistake. "It cannot be," he replied at first. "What would he be doing here?" My mother continued looking at the truck as they rolled slowly past the entrance. "I am almost certain that is his." My father glanced toward the company sign, but the traffic behind them forced him to continue driving before he could read it clearly. Curious now, he circled the block and returned a few minutes later, parking across the street where they had a clear view of the building. The old pickup remained exactly where it had been, standing quietly among delivery vehicles and employee cars. Neither of them realized that within the next few minutes they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they had believed about their son for years. My parents remained parked across the street for several minutes, watching employees come and go through the front entrance of the building. Neither of them spoke at first because they were both trying to understand why my old pickup was sitting beside a modern manufacturing facility that looked far larger than any place they imagined I might visit on a Saturday. My father finally broke the silence. "Maybe he has a meeting here," he said. My mother nodded slowly. "That would make sense." Even as she said the words, she did not sound completely convinced. The truck was parked too comfortably, almost as if it belonged there. My father looked around the parking lot again. Luxury sport utility vehicles, newer pickup trucks, and several company fleet vehicles filled the employee spaces, yet my faded blue truck remained in exactly the same location near the side entrance. "Should we call him?" my mother asked. My father glanced at his phone before lowering it again. "No. Let us see if he comes out." They had no intention of spying on me. Curiosity had simply taken over. They expected to see me leave the building carrying a briefcase or perhaps shaking hands with a client before driving home. Instead, something entirely different unfolded. About 10 minutes later, several employees exited the building together. They laughed while talking about weekend plans before stopping beside my truck. One of them leaned against the bed of the pickup while waiting for someone inside. My father frowned slightly. "Looks like they know whoever owns it." Before either of them could say anything else, the side entrance opened again. I stepped outside holding a folder under one arm while Rachel Evans walked beside me. We continued discussing production schedules as we crossed the parking lot. My parents immediately recognized me. "There he is," my mother whispered. My father smiled. "See? I told you he must have had a meeting." Then everything changed. Before I even reached the truck, nearly a dozen employees who had been walking through the parking lot greeted me one after another. "Have a great weekend, Jacob." "See you Monday, Jacob." "Thanks for everything this week." Every greeting sounded natural and respectful rather than formal. My father watched carefully. "He seems to know a lot of people here." My mother nodded. "They certainly know him." Just then another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Andrew Collins stepped out and quickly caught up with me before I reached the truck. Even from across the street, my parents could see us shaking hands. After a brief conversation, Andrew smiled, patted me on the shoulder, and climbed back into his vehicle. Moments later, another man hurried from the building carrying several documents. Instead of handing them to Rachel or another employee, he brought them directly to me. I reviewed the papers for a moment, signed the final page, and handed them back. The employee thanked me before returning inside. My father leaned forward in his seat. That looked important. My mother quietly replied, "It did." They continued watching as I finally opened the driver's side door of my pickup, but before I climbed inside, another group of employees approached. One young technician pointed toward a piece of equipment on a nearby trailer, asking what appeared to be a technical question. I listened carefully, walked over with him, examined the equipment for a few moments, and explained something while the others nodded. When the conversation ended, everyone thanked me before returning to their own vehicles. My father slowly lowered his sunglasses. "Karen, that was not an ordinary conversation." "No," she answered softly. "It was not." A few moments later, a woman wearing a company identification badge exited the building carrying a small box. She walked directly toward my truck. My parents watched as Rachel smiled and handed me the box. Although they could not hear the conversation, they saw both of us laugh before she waved goodbye and headed back inside. My father looked again at the company building. "Who exactly is he here?" he asked almost to himself. Neither of them had an answer. They had assumed I worked for a successful company. Now they were no longer certain what my role actually was. The way people approached me was different. They were not simply greeting a coworker. They seemed to be looking for guidance. My mother finally noticed the company sign near the entrance. "Michael," she said, pointing toward it. "Can you read the name?" He narrowed his eyes before slowly sounding it out. "Carter Industrial Systems." He paused for a second. "Carter." My mother turned toward him. "That cannot be a coincidence." My father looked back toward the building, then toward my truck, then once more at the large sign displaying the company name. "Maybe there is another Carter." My mother remained quiet because the same thought had already crossed her mind. At that moment, I started the pickup and slowly drove toward the exit. As I reached the street, another employee standing near the entrance raised his hand and called out, "See you Monday, boss." The word was impossible to miss. My father heard it clearly. My mother heard it too. Both of them sat completely still as my truck passed in front of their car and disappeared into afternoon traffic. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Finally, my father turned back toward the building with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not confusion anymore. It was the unmistakable realization that the story they had believed about their son for years was beginning to fall apart, and they had only seen the very first piece of the truth. My parents drove home that afternoon with far fewer words than usual. Normally, my father filled every drive with observations about traffic, home improvement projects, or the latest news, but this time silence occupied most of the trip. Every few miles, one of them would glance at the other, as if hoping the other person had already found a reasonable explanation for what they had witnessed. By the time they reached home, my mother finally asked the question both of them had been avoiding. "Do you think we have misunderstood Jacob?" My father rested his hands on the kitchen counter before answering. "I do not know what to think anymore." He poured 2 cups of coffee, even though it was already late in the afternoon, then sat across from my mother at the dining room table. Those people did not treat him like an ordinary employee. My mother nodded. They listened to him. They thanked him. One man even called him boss. My father slowly shook his head. "Maybe he manages a department." "Then why is the company called Carter Industrial Systems?" she asked quietly. Neither of them had an answer. That evening, curiosity finally overcame uncertainty. My father opened his laptop and typed the company name into a search engine. Within seconds, the official company website appeared on the screen. The homepage displayed photographs of modern manufacturing equipment, smiling employees, and a short statement describing the company's mission of helping American manufacturers improve productivity through practical automation solutions. My father continued scrolling until he reached the section introducing the leadership team. His hand stopped moving. My mother leaned closer to the screen. There, beneath the words founder and chief executive officer, was my photograph. The same simple headshot I had approved months earlier after insisting that the marketing department avoid anything too formal. My father stared at the screen without speaking. My mother quietly placed one hand over her mouth. Beneath my photograph was a short biography describing how I had founded the company 7 years earlier, expanded it into multiple states, and focused on building long-term partnerships with customers while creating stable careers for skilled workers. There were also several articles highlighting awards the company had received for workplace culture and community involvement. My father clicked on one interview after another. In each article, I spoke almost entirely about employees, teamwork, customers, and responsibility. There was almost nothing about personal success or financial achievements. Finally, my father leaned back in his chair and whispered, "Why did he never tell us?" My mother answered softly, "Maybe because we never really asked." Those words remained in the room long after she finished speaking. Looking back, they both realized that every conversation about my work had ended the same way. They asked whether business was going well. I answered that things were moving in the right direction, and before another question could be asked, someone usually returned to joking about my truck or suggesting I should finally buy something newer. My parents had always assumed they already understood my life. They had never realized how much they had filled the empty spaces with their own assumptions. The following Sunday, my parents invited me to dinner again. Nothing in my mother's voice sounded unusual when she called earlier that morning. She simply asked whether I could come by around 5 o'clock. I agreed without suspecting anything had changed. When I arrived, my father stepped outside before I reached the front door. His eyes immediately settled on the old pickup parked in the driveway. But this time he did not smile or make a joke. Instead, he quietly walked around the truck, studying it with a different expression than I had ever seen before. "Still running well?" he asked. "Very well," I answered. He nodded thoughtfully before we walked inside together. Dinner felt different from the beginning. My mother seemed unusually quiet, and my father asked far more questions about work than he ever had before. He wanted to know how many people worked for the company, how business had grown, and whether I enjoyed leading such a large organization. I answered each question honestly but briefly, never realizing they already knew much of the story. After dessert, my father finally looked directly at me and spoke with unexpected seriousness. "Jacob, there is something your mother and I need to ask you." I set my coffee cup down and waited. He took a slow breath before continuing. "Yesterday, we accidentally drove past your company." I smiled slightly. "Really?" He nodded. "We saw your truck outside." For a brief moment, neither of us said anything. Then my mother quietly added, "We also looked up Carter Industrial Systems after we came home." I understood immediately. There was no surprise, no embarrassment, and certainly no anger. Only a calm acceptance that this conversation had finally arrived. My father lowered his eyes before speaking again. "Why did you never tell us that you built all of that?" I smiled gently because the answer had been with me for years. Because I never wanted my relationship with my family to depend on what I owned or what title I had. I wanted you to know me, not my business. My parents remained silent. Then my father looked toward the window where the old pickup sat in the driveway. "And the truck?" he asked quietly. I followed his gaze before smiling to myself. That story is even more important than the company. My parents looked back at me without saying a word, knowing they were finally about to hear the truth they had spent years overlooking. I looked at my parents for a long moment before standing from the table. "Come with me," I said quietly. They followed me outside without another question. The evening air was cool, and the old blue pickup rested in the driveway exactly where I had parked it an hour earlier. I walked slowly toward the driver's side and rested my hand on the hood, just as I had done thousands of times before. "Most people see an old truck," I said. "I see the person who taught me what kind of man I wanted to become." My father remained silent while my mother folded her arms against the cool breeze. I opened the driver's door and pointed toward the worn bench seat. "When I was 8 years old, Grandpa picked me up here almost every Saturday morning before the sun came up. We drove all over Central Ohio making deliveries for his small repair business. He never owned a fancy office. He never wore expensive clothes. He simply showed up every day, worked honestly, and kept every promise he made." I smiled as memories filled my mind with remarkable clarity. Whenever we stopped for breakfast, he always ordered the same thing: eggs, toast, black coffee, and a pancake for me. He used to tell me that people spend too much time trying to look successful and not enough time becoming someone others can trust. My father slowly nodded because he remembered those mornings too. My grandfather had lived by simple principles that rarely changed. I continued. "One afternoon, only a few months before he passed away, we were driving home after delivering equipment to a customer. I asked him why he never bought a newer truck. He laughed and told me something I have never forgotten. He said, 'Jacob, if I ever believe a different truck will make me a better man, then I have forgotten everything that actually matters.' My mother quietly wiped away a tear as I continued speaking. When Grandpa became too sick to work, he asked me to visit him one evening. We sat together on the porch while this truck was parked right over there beside his garage. He handed me the keys and said, "Someday you are going to build something much bigger than I ever did. Promise me one thing. Never let success convince you that your beginning was something to hide." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the same worn keychain my grandfather had given me years earlier. The leather was faded from time, but I had never replaced it. I promised him that as long as this truck could safely stay on the road, I would keep driving it to remind myself where every opportunity came from. Neither of my parents interrupted. They simply listened. When I started the company, I could barely afford to rent a small warehouse. This truck carried every tool, every shipment, every piece of equipment I could not afford to have delivered. It was parked outside during my first customer meeting, my first employee interview, and my first profitable month. Every milestone happened with this truck waiting outside. My father looked across the hood as if seeing it for the very first time. The faded paint no longer represented neglect. The small dent above the rear will no longer look like damage. Every mark reflected years of work, patience, and determination. As the company grew, I continued. People started suggesting that I replace it. They said customers expected successful business owners to drive luxury vehicles. So I tried an experiment. I kept showing up exactly like this. I smiled. Do you know what happened? My parents quietly shook their heads. The customers who cared only about appearances usually were not the right partners for us anyway. The customers who valued honesty stayed for years because they realized we invested in quality instead of image. I glanced toward my father before continuing. Every dollar I did not spend trying to impress people became another machine, another employee, another training program, or another scholarship fund for local trade schools. That old truck quietly helped build opportunities for dozens of families because I never felt the need to prove anything with what I drove. My mother looked at me with eyes full of understanding. "Jacob," she whispered, "we thought you were denying yourself." I smiled gently. I was actually protecting something much more valuable. My father slowly stepped closer to the truck. He carefully placed one hand on the hood, almost exactly where mine had been resting moments earlier. "All these years," he said quietly, "I believed I was encouraging you to enjoy your success." He paused before continuing. "I never realized you had already found a way to enjoy it that was far more meaningful." I nodded. "Success gave me choices, Dad. One of those choices was deciding never to forget the people who helped me become the man I am today." The three of us stood together in the quiet driveway as the last light of the evening faded across the neighborhood. For the first time in years, nobody mentioned buying a different truck. Nobody joked about faded paint or worn seats. Instead, my parents looked at the pickup with the same respect they once had for the man who had driven it before me, finally understanding that its greatest value had never been measured in dollars, but in the lessons it had faithfully carried from one generation to the next. The conversation in the driveway stayed with all of us long after that evening ended. Something had shifted, not because anyone had won an argument, but because the truth had quietly replaced years of assumptions. The following week, my father called me several times, although none of those conversations included a single joke about the truck. Instead, he asked about my employees, the expansion of the company, and how I managed to keep everyone working toward the same purpose. I answered every question honestly, and for the first time in years, our conversations felt less like advice from a parent and more like two adults learning from one another. A few days later, my father surprised me by asking if he could visit the company. "Not because I want a tour," he explained. "I would like to understand what you have built." I invited both of my parents to come the following Friday morning. When they arrived, I met them outside near the familiar parking space where the old pickup rested beneath the bright Ohio sunshine. This time, my father walked directly toward the truck instead of looking past it. He smiled softly as he ran his hand across the faded blue paint. "Your grandfather would have been proud to see this," he said. "Not because you still have the truck, but because you remembered what it stood for." I smiled. That is exactly what I hoped. We walked into the building together, and almost immediately employees greeted my parents with warm smiles. Rachel Evans welcomed them personally before introducing herself. "It is wonderful to finally meet the people Jacob talks about so often," she said. My mother looked surprised. "He talks about us?" Rachel laughed. "Quite a bit, especially family dinners." My father smiled with quiet embarrassment, probably remembering how many of those dinners had included comments about the truck. As we continued through the building, my parents noticed something they had not fully appreciated during the brief glimpse from across the street. Employees did not simply respect me because I held a leadership position. They spoke openly, offered ideas without hesitation, and laughed naturally during conversations. The atmosphere felt more like a community than a workplace. At one production station, a technician stopped what he was doing long enough to shake my father's hand. "You raised a remarkable son," he said sincerely. "He has changed a lot of lives here." My father looked at me for a brief moment before replying. "I think I am still discovering that myself." We continued into the engineering department, where several young designers demonstrated equipment that would soon be shipped to customers across the country. One of them explained how the company's apprenticeship program had given him his first opportunity after technical school. Another employee described how flexible schedules had allowed her to care for an aging parent without leaving her career. Every conversation centered on people instead of profits. My mother quietly whispered, "Now I understand why everyone speaks about this place the way they do." I nodded. The products matter, but the people matter more. Before lunch, I gathered everyone in the employee meeting area for a short announcement. We had officially completed the partnership agreement Andrew Collins had been negotiating for months. The room filled with applause. But before anyone congratulated me, I thanked every employee for making the opportunity possible. Then I announced that part of the new investment would fund expanded training programs, additional hiring, and a scholarship initiative for students entering skilled trades. The applause became even louder. My parents stood near the back of the room, watching every reaction. There were smiles everywhere, not because investors had arrived, but because more opportunities would soon be created for other families. After the meeting ended, one of the newest employees approached my father while I answered questions from several supervisors. "Sir," the young man said, "I hope you know how fortunate we all are that Jacob never cared about looking successful. Every extra dollar went back into this company. That is one of the reasons I have this job today." My father thanked him quietly before walking outside alone. A few minutes later, I found him standing beside the pickup once again. He looked across the parking lot for several seconds before turning toward me. "Jacob," he said softly, "I owe you an apology." I immediately shook my head. "Dad, you do not have to apologize." "Yes," he replied firmly. "I do." He took a slow breath before continuing. "For years I believed I was encouraging you to enjoy life. In reality, I was judging your choices without understanding your reasons. I measured success by things people could see because that was how I had always understood it. You taught me this week that the most important accomplishments are often invisible." I smiled warmly. "You taught me to work hard. Grandpa taught me why. Everything else simply grew from those lessons." My father's eyes became emotional as he looked at the truck one more time. "I spent years wishing you would trade it for something newer." He smiled gently. "Now I hope it stays with you for as long as it possibly can." For the first time since I had inherited those keys from my grandfather, I realized the promise attached to that old pickup had quietly fulfilled another purpose. It had not only reminded me where I came from, it had also helped the people I loved rediscover what truly defines a person's success. 1 year passed more quickly than any of us expected. Carter Industrial Systems continued growing, not because we chased headlines or recognition, but because we stayed committed to the same principles that had guided us from the beginning. We opened another production facility, expanded our apprenticeship program, and welcomed dozens of new employees whose families now enjoyed opportunities that had not existed before. Every major decision still began with the same simple question my grandfather had taught me to ask many years earlier. Would this create lasting value, or would it simply create the appearance of success? That single question had become the foundation of every choice I made. On the first Monday morning of every month, I still arrived before sunrise, unlocked the building, and walked through the quiet production floor before anyone else arrived. Those peaceful moments reminded me that every company, regardless of its size, was ultimately built one ordinary day at a time. Outside, the same blue pickup remained parked in its familiar place beside the loading dock. The paint had faded a little more, the odometer displayed even more miles, and the engine sounded slightly rougher than it had a year earlier, but it continued doing exactly what it had always done. It carried me to work, brought me home, and quietly reminded me that the distance between humble beginnings and meaningful success should never erase the path that connected them. My father no longer asked when I planned to replace it. Instead, he occasionally asked whether I had changed the oil on time or whether I needed help finding replacement parts for an older model that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. The jokes had disappeared, replaced by something much more valuable: respect. Our family dinners changed as well. Conversations no longer centered on appearances, expensive purchases, or what people might think. Instead, my father often asked about the newest apprentices joining the company. My mother wanted to hear stories about employees reaching important milestones, and even my sister Sophia admitted one evening that she had spent too much time assuming. Successful people always looked a certain way. I think we all learned something, she said with a smile. Especially me. I smiled back because there was nothing left to prove. Sometimes the greatest victories were the quiet ones that changed hearts instead of headlines. Late that autumn, our company held the annual scholarship ceremony for students entering technical education programs throughout Ohio. It had become one of my favorite traditions because it celebrated hard work before success had fully arrived. The event took place inside a community training center where local families gathered to support young men and women beginning their careers. After the ceremony ended, many students stayed behind to speak with employees, instructors, and business leaders about their future goals. As everyone walked toward the parking lot, my father looked around before quietly asking, "Did you drive the truck today?" I smiled. "Of course." He laughed softly. "Good. I was hoping you had." Together we walked toward the familiar blue pickup waiting beneath a row of maple trees with golden autumn leaves drifting gently across the pavement. My father stopped beside the passenger door instead of heading toward his own car. "Would you mind if I rode with you for a while?" he asked. "Not at all," I answered. He climbed into the passenger seat, looked around the simple interior, and smiled when he noticed the old leather keychain hanging beneath the ignition. "Your grandfather used to keep peppermint candies in the glove compartment," he said. I laughed. "There are still a few in there." He opened the compartment, found a small bag exactly where he expected, and shook his head with a smile that carried years of memories. Some traditions are worth keeping. We drove through quiet country roads outside Columbus without any destination in mind. Neither of us felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. After several miles, my father looked through the windshield and spoke in a calm voice. "I used to believe that people would judge our family by what they saw. Now I think they remember us because of how we treat people." I nodded. "That is a much stronger legacy." He smiled. "Your grandfather understood that long before either of us did." As we continued driving beneath the colorful trees, I realized that the greatest gift my grandfather had left behind had never been an old pickup truck. It had been a way of seeing the world that refused to confuse appearance with character, comfort with purpose, or wealth with worth. The truck had simply carried those lessons from one generation to the next until each of us was finally ready to understand them. When we reached my parents' house, my father stepped out but paused before closing the passenger door. He rested one hand gently on the roof of the pickup and smiled. "Take good care of her," he said. "She has taken good care of our family." I smiled back. "I will." As I drove away, I caught one final glimpse of my parents standing together in the driveway, watching the old blue truck disappear down the road. This time there was no laughter, no embarrassment, and no misunderstanding. There was only quiet gratitude for a lesson that had arrived years later than expected, but would remain with our family for the rest of our lives. Some people spend their entire lives searching for something expensive that will make them feel successful. Others discover that the greatest treasures are the ordinary things that faithfully remind them who they have always been, where they began, and why those beginnings should never be forgotten.